right. Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the state you're in. If you're in Mountain Time, it's still 11:30. I'm Eric Kahn, joined by Talon Muse, Dylan Mangel, Kyle Broderick, and Tamara Jackson Sims. Lots of expertise here with regard to plant diseases. Those four with plant diseases, not me. I'm a meteorologist. I know more about plant disease than I did 3 years ago, but my knowledge is still pretty small. Start with a quick weather update. So we had some very, very intense heat over the weekend in the Panhandle. Temperatures were as high as 109 in Chadron yesterday, 107 in Scotts Bluff. Very, very warm today across portions of the southern Panhandle, southwestern Nebraska. We have been coming off, or we were coming off a stretch of pretty intense heat across the entire state about middle of last week. The afternoon temperatures were certainly above average. In some cases, we were getting the upper 90s, lower 100s, even into central and eastern Nebraska. But I think the bigger story with the temperatures were the sustained minimum temperatures in the low to mid 70s, some cases upper 70s to lower 80s. I think that had impacts on both crops and livestock. Moisture around the state lately has been fairly hit and miss. Now, we did actually get some good precip totals across northeastern Nebraska on Thursday morning. That for some people, that was the first really good moisture they've had. In some cases, all summer, certainly in a while. We also had some pretty good moisture totals across portions of south central and southeastern Nebraska last week. I am very suspicious, though, that some of that rain came very hard, very fast, and I'm not sure how much it actually infiltrated in the ground. Soil moisture did show some decent response at a lot of the mesonet sites, but suffice to say, we don't necessarily have a great reserve of moisture. And we do have some good moisture chances coming in through at least the southern half of the state tomorrow into early Wednesday. I think later today and tonight, there's going to be some chances in west central and northeast Nebraska. I do think we are going to be entering into a period later this week into early next week that is going to be very warm again, probably very warm at night. Not necessarily looking at really high wind speeds. We have not had as high of wind speeds this summer as we've had in some summers. We also, to a large degree, have not had as strong of or as persistent of a southerly fetch of winds. The other thing that's different, while it's been very humid across the eastern portion of the state, the vapor pressure deficit, which kind of takes a measure of atmospheric aridity, was not quite as low this year in, say, west central and portions of central Nebraska. So, for example, out where Talon is in Lexington, over toward about Kearney, maybe even as far east as Grand Island, there were noticeably um, the vapor pressure deficit was noticeably higher in July this year than it was last year. So I don't think the humidity and the sunshine and the wind speed has been quite as optimal as it was last year for southern rust. And I think that's one of the reasons we have not seen that southern rust map light up. So that's kind of the weather update for now. I will try to put out another podcast. I'll be out of the office later this week. I may try to get another podcast out later this week yet on the weather. But for now, that's the story on the weather. So let's just turn it over to Kyle. Kyle is actually currently in Rhode Island, but he monitors the plant and pest diagnostic clinic over here on
Mhm.
East Campus. So, Kyle, what's been coming into the clinic?
Yeah, it's honestly, I will say this is a good thing for the growers out there, but it's been kind of a boring year in the diagnostic
And
clinics
that's
from
the
a,
first time I've ever heard you say that.
it's we're seeing a lot of stuff, but we're seeing a lot of different diseases coming in, but we're not seeing outbreaks of anything. And yes, we're seeing some southern rust and a lot of common rust and gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, bacterial leaf streak. You know, we're seeing a little bit of all of it, but luckily nothing too crazy. And really on the soybean side, the main thing that I've been seeing has been downy mildew. And so just some of those pathogens that show up on a regular basis aren't known to cause major yield losses.
Did you say Downy?
Yes,
Does that spell like
yep,
the detergent?
it is. Yep, DOWNY mildew, and so it's really pretty. It's one of my favorite fungi to look at under the microscope, honestly. Um, but yeah, so it's the same thing on soybeans. We're just not seeing outbreaks of anything, and I'm not walking the fields. Dylan, Tamra, they may have other information. But even as I've been having conversations with colleagues of mine in other diagnostic clinics in the north central region, it's kind of the same thing. They're seeing a lot of different stuff, but pretty low incidence of a lot of these things, or low severity.
Do you think the weather has had maybe a bit more of a positive impact this year?
Yeah, I do. I really, I think that heat, it's been too hot for a lot of diseases. And we may not feel a big difference between 75 and 78 degrees, but a lot of fungi really do. And just since we've had these warmer temperatures, that's one of my guesses as to
It,
why we're not seeing as much.
well, that would track. So this is July of 20. I haven't seen the official numbers for July, but just by looking at stations around the state and throughout the north central region of the country, it was the warmest July that we've had since 2022. It was definitely warmer than 2023 and 24 were probably a little on the cool side. Last year was about average. This year was certainly a bit on the warm side. And the low temperatures, which have been elevated been going up for a while, I think were even especially elevated later in the month. The other thing that we had this July that we have not had in a while, we did have some temperatures that were 9,902 that we probably haven't seen between mid-July and early August, probably since 2022
Yeah,
for a lot of
and
people.
and even the diseases that really like the heat, gray leaf spot, southern rust really likes the heat too. That's just too hot it's too hot for people to be out. Fungus doesn't want to be out in those conditions either. So,
All right, thanks for that
So
report.
I
Go
guess
ahead,
I
Talon.
have an interesting question maybe for both of you. I got some pictures in today that I think are is a lightning strike in a soybean field. Kyle, have you ever gotten any of those kind of samples in the clinic?
yeah, that's super fun. So if you can get a sample, it will have a smell to it, um, because it's burned tissue. So you can typically smell lightning if you're out in the field. Other thing is you want to look at distribution within the field. Typically, a lightning strike is going to be a nice, pretty close to perfect circle, of plants that burn, and then some of those plants on the edge of the area where the strike happened. Sometimes there's going to be some nice like red streaking on them as well. Again, just from that burning. Yeah, lightning strike. I was actually just talking with someone earlier today about a lightning strike in a potato field. So,
From Nebraska?
no, that was they're in Wisconsin.
Oh, okay. Well, say we certainly have had a fair number of thunderstorms, of late. We have actually, for as dry as some places in the state are, we have other places have had a lot of rain, and that's mostly been coming in the form of thunderstorms. So it's not that shocking that maybe some soybean plant or corn plant got struck by lightning. That certainly would strike me as being very feasible.
Yeah, I'm guessing. So it was Wednesday morning, I think, last week. I was driving up to the Manure Expo up in Wayne, and I think it had already said Elm Creek, Kearney area had already gotten like an inch and a half or so, and I was pretty much driving through a thunderstorm. So I think we had plenty of the weather there, and thankfully
Yeah,
caught some of those nice rains. And I think this storm was probably big enough that a lot of the region caught at least some precipitation. This year, it seems like everything's so variable by the amount of rain. I don't know, is that something you're seeing there?
No, you're absolutely right, Tal. It has been variable, which is not that unusual. It's usually summer precipitation in this part of the country is not real uniform, but I would say compared to last year, where we were predominantly just overwhelmingly wet across most of the state with varying degrees of wetness, this year, some places have had lots of rain, some places have had about average, some places have been well short. And the difference in actual spatial distance between places that have done very well versus not is not necessarily always that great. Some cases it could be 10 miles. And that's not just unique to Nebraska. For example, there's places in western Iowa that didn't have an inch of rain in July. You go 80 miles east toward Des Moines metro area, it's someplace at 15 inches. So, I mean, really sharp gradients have been, and some of that is just because we have gotten most of our precipitation this summer from ridge riding thunderstorms. That ridge has been sort of meandering around somewhere between Wichita and Phoenix here in the last 3 or 4 weeks. And when it's been a bit to our south and west, we've been in a favorable area. Well, I think parts of northeast Nebraska have been mostly shafted this summer. It's definitely benefited, say, like Seward, Lincoln, some parts of southeast Nebraska, but then again, like other parts of the state have not gotten much. So that's not the most unusual thing this summer, but yeah, last summer was consistently much wetter. I would also say much cloudier during an important time of year. I see Tamara shaking her head, kind of in agreement. So, Tamara, I know you've been working with corn diseases for a long time. Would it be fair to say last year was one of the worst years you've ever seen for corn diseases?
Absolutely. Last year was one of those marker years that I'm going to remember forevermore. Um, the the other one would be 2006. Those are two of the worst that I can think of. Both of those times there were tremendous outbreaks of southern rust. And there were similarities between the years, right? I think you had helped us investigate that historically, and those years have a big impact on diseases. And now that, we're understanding those patterns better and better. And as I've heard my colleagues say, no matter what the conditions are, there's almost always a disease to take advantage of it. And so we just have to be ready for that.
Yeah, but I took a look at the crop protection network map about a couple hours right before I walked home for lunch, and there were definitely were counties that have lit up here in the last week or so. So we clearly have it in the state, but this time last year it seemed like it was much more widespread and prevalent. Was that a fair assessment?
At least eventually, I think word gets out, and it's important that people understand how to interpret those maps. And, when there's a lot of disease activity, people are actively looking, we're getting a lot more samples in, a lot more pictures of what they're seeing too. And so there's a human factor here that affects these maps, and there's a lot of things that contribute to that too. And so keeping in mind that counties, just because they're not colored, doesn't mean there's not disease there. It just means we haven't gotten a sample or someone hasn't stumbled across it yet. So if you're in one of those counties and you're seeing something, I encourage everybody to send a sample in. Go to Crop Protection Network Crop Lookout page. You can also submit reports on there with just pictures. There's a lot of ways to help share your information, and you can even do it anonymously.
Yeah, but it seems that last year that we had more of that around here by like mid-July, which seemed very early.
I think the first day I think Kyle and I talked about it was about July 15th. Kyle, do you remember that? I was on my way to the airport actually, and so
Yep.
I remember that, and we
And well, and I would say it seemed early last year, but I had gone back and looked at historical data. 'Cause I think 2006 was the first year, right? Um, but it's always been right. I mean, within 2 or 3 days of that July 15th. This year was a little bit late, but historically, yeah, that middle of July just seems to be prime conditions. And one of the things that I think helped last year with us not finding so many counties right away is just because of how much other disease pressure was out there. And there were a lot of people out walking fields, and and we have some great consultants. They want to be the first one to find southern rust, and so they want to be the reason that we light up some of those counties. And so last year we just had people out looking at a more. I think more.
So, in other words, just because there was more overall disease pressure, it's possible that we were just finding southern rust and tar spot more frequently just because more people were out looking.
I think there's maybe an aspect to that, but then at the same time, as we've discussed, last year was a prime year for disease development. So there was, I mean, it was combination of the two.
And looking at your historic data, Eric, I think it brings a good example to bear here to talk about. Kyle, you've got records from the clinic on, the first sightings or reports of it. And they're all within that, July time frame. So it's not that it showed up earlier, but what does it find when it gets here? And last year was the prime example of the elevated humidity, the cloudy conditions we were having. That really determines what happens next, whether it's going to blow up or just kind of simmer in the background like a lot of these diseases are doing right now.
Right. So the average dew points for most locations east of Lexington have been at or maybe slightly above last year in July. But the actual humidity, so relative humidity, which is vapor pressure over saturation vapor pressure, there's related to dew point, but relative humidity on a hot summer afternoon could be in the 40% if it's humid. So that number doesn't necessarily always mean relative to comfort, but because it was cooler last year with about the same dew points, that meant that the relative humidity was just flat out consistently higher. And I believe it was often staying at very elevated levels through, in a lot of cases, the mid morning, some cases early afternoon, because of how much cloud cover we were having in the first part of the day. And my guess is we have not had as much of that on a widespread basis this summer. We've had more days where it's been the air temperature's gotten hotter. We've had distinct anomalies of cloud cover in this region that we have not had at any point this summer. That may even have more impact than even the relatively lower humidities, even though I would say for most of us, it hasn't been as much lower. I suppose it's also possible that we just haven't, unless, other than things being irrigated constantly, we have not had nearly as much rain in some parts of the state where you have just constant leaf wetness. You might have higher humidity at times. My guess is if it's raining every 2 days, those leaves are just staying wet. I don't think we've had as much of that this year to work with. So that might explain the lack of as good of a host. So we'll talk about treatment here in a little bit. I just want to switch over and talk about soybeans. So we got Dylan, our soybean plant pathologist. Or what's your title, Dylan?
Extension soybean pathologist works.
Okay, so you're more like you're a soybean specialist. Tamer's a corn specialist.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
We're partners.
It took me a couple of years finally to get straight that you mostly are focused on soybeans. And she said,
Yeah.
Anyway, I know Kyle mentioned there's mildew seems to be an issue.
Yeah.
What else have you been finding, either scouting or what you've heard from other growers?
Well, I think the big concern for a lot of growers is white mold, especially if they've had a history of it. That's their concern. And you were just talking about that dew point, those mornings, that humidity. And my indicator that I like to use for this is when I come down in the morning from, getting ready and I walk into my dining room. It's an old house with old windows. And sometimes those are completely fogged over, like you can't even see out of them. And 2023, I remember I just kept every morning, it was like fogged over, fogged over, fogged over. And this year, there's been about 2 mornings where I've noticed that. We've just had a lot more mornings where we didn't have that humidity. Cars aren't wet when you come out and stuff. Leaves aren't going to be wet either. So it's just drier. On that note, we've had a lot fewer mornings where I walk out and look at my yard and there's new mushrooms sprouted up overnight. We just haven't had that moisture. We've had reasonable moisture, so people aren't really hurting really bad for it, but we haven't had that consistent little bit of moisture all the time that's really going to drive a lot of these. But we do have, so I think white mold risk is relatively low. If you've had areas with a history, look in those and see if you've got it so far this year. If you've applied, maybe think twice if you want to rush out and apply a second application, depending on if it's there or not. But they can go and look and see that because they know where it's been. But one thing we haven't thought about yet too much is the diseases that infected the plants back when they were seedlings early on in the season, when there was some moisture, when we had planting conditions, we put it in, and some of those beans sat there for a long time. So things are infecting those plants then, and they're just kind of hanging out, growing with the plant. But they really catch up with the plant towards the end of July and into August.
Yeah. So,
Those
Dylan, have
things,
you been? Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, go on.
Have you been seeing any SDS? Because I
That's
know
what
that
I'm leading up to.
So that
yeah.
being sudden death syndrome.
Yep.
Yep.
And
So sudden death syndrome of soybean, it can get in there, infect those plants early, and it just waits. And then come August, maybe mid-August, you'll really start to see those leaves fluoresce, that um, interveinal chlorosis or yellowing between the veins on the upper leaves. You'll start to see that. But if I can, let me share my screen real quick. Uh, we've got other things that cause that same symptom. And it's not always sudden death syndrome, but I think sudden death syndrome often gets picked for it or blamed for it. Can you guys see that green map I'm showing?
Yes.
So this is a new disease called red crown rot of soybean. It's not new, but it's new to our area. So it's just really come up here into the I states and has been spreading rapidly from the south where it had been for ages. But recently, we just saw it at the end of last summer in Minnesota, which is about 70 miles from Nebraska. There's been potential reports, but not verified, of it in this county up here in the corner, and a couple other counties in the state. So we're trying to verify it, but we're just not able to find it or verify it. But we want to monitor closely because that's going to show up. And let me show you the symptoms for this one. The leaf symptom is very similar. You're going to have chlorosis or yellowing right between the veins. From your truck on the road, it's going to look just like sudden death syndrome, but it's important to go out there and see what this is. You can pull those plants up. You can look at the root of that plant, split stems, and it'll give you some ideas of which one of those it is. And we can we've got guides on the internet that help you pick some of those symptoms apart. But this is what we're really looking for. This is red crown rot. So it's not just red staining on the crown.
Like little pieces of candy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that all the time. Maybe I've spent too much time with fungus, but the more time you spend around these things, the more you imagine what they taste like.
Hey, maybe it's a cure for some disease.
So yeah, these ones have actual little spheres all over. And it's not always there, but if you catch them at the right time, these will be there. So definitely, if anyone sees these, call me and I'd love to come take a look at it and verify that that's what you're dealing with. Because
and
yep.
if you're going to collect any samples of any of those, want to get the entire plant too. And so just
Including the
getting the
roots?
leaves, yep, including the roots. I think with red crown, that's because you can have those spheres under the soil line too. Am I correct on that, Dylan? I've never seen it in person.
I've not either, Kyle. I'm actually taking a trip here soon to go look at some in Illinois. But they're right around that soil surface. So I think you could see them down there a little bit too. I've never seen pictures of them like on the roots, but all over the crown of that plant for sure. But be aware for it.
So we have not verified that's actually been in Nebraska to this point.
Not yet. But there was a time when sudden death syndrome wasn't here, and that wasn't that long ago either. So these
Tar
things
spot
can
wasn't
come.
here. Now it
Yeah.
is.
If we put millions of acres of food in somewhere,
So
things that like to eat it are going to show up.
what type of environment does it prefer? I'm assuming is it similar to other things we've talked about?
I think it's pretty similar to sudden death syndrome. In fact, it's probably here already. We don't know at what level because we're just looking for the first time and really trying to identify it. So the best case scenario will be that some of what we've been calling sudden death syndrome up to this point might just be acres impacted by red crown rot. So hopefully we don't see a whole new thing come in and add a bunch of more yield loss. Now, I will say that our laboratory, Kyle's lab, would have noticed if he had received red crown rot up till this point. But so I don't think we're getting them in. It's probably at a low level if it is here. But it's important that we find it because disease management is going to be specific to which of those you actually have.
Are the impacts to yield comparable between the two?
I think they're pretty comparable. They can range a lot in how much yield they're going to take, and it really comes down to what variety you have, how much water stress you have in those fields.
If you have sudden death syndrome, does that basically means that you don't fill out the pods at all?
You'll just fill them out less in most cases.
Okay,
But
so
if
there's
you
still
pick
some
up,
yield potential. It's just as
yeah,
reduced or significantly reduced.
yep, yep, and it depends on a lot of other factors.
Have you seen any of these kind of like root diseases? Do they ever like co-infect? Like, will you see symptoms of both on like a single plant or
Yeah.
anything like that?
So Teddy Aroca Garcia, or Teddy Garcia Aroca in our department here at the plant pathology department, he just had a student finish up some research on fusarium on soybean roots, and he found a lot of co-infection of different fusarium pathogens on soybean roots. So it's definitely happening. We also see it with other non-fungi like sudden or soybean cyst nematode. We don't know how much they're interacting, but we do see both of those impacting root systems at the same time, and yield loss is worse when they're both there. So there's a lot of potential.
That's
Oh, and
more of an, that's an insect issue.
It's a nematode,
Okay.
so it blurs the lines between the insects and the pathogens. We don't really know where we want to put it, but
Well, what would Justin McMecken call it?
he would call
a
it
worm.
not an insect.
Not an okay. Okay.
Well, and I was going back to Talon's question. The other thing I'm seeing a lot in soybeans right now is a lot of Phytophthora is finally coming into the clinic, and that's another one of those that infected early in the season, and now we're seeing it. But I can find fusarium on every one of those two, and so yeah, we get co-infections are very common. Just look at a corn leaf, and
Yeah.
in 2 to 3 weeks, you're going to find probably 5 to 7 diseases on any corn leaf that you look at.
Lovely.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this is a good time to start pivoting into management of said diseases. I'm assuming that for some of the things that we've been talking about, the management approaches are in some cases similar, in some cases they're probably not. Dylan, since you've been speaking about soybean, maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll pivot back over to Talon and Tamara to talk about corn.
Yeah, I think it's going to be definitely more critical in corn right now, but that's important to know too, and think about what not to manage because sudden death syndrome, for example, it's a foliar symptom, but a foliar fungicide is not going to do anything for it. The damage was done long ago. Same with white mold. We're getting into the later parts of the white mold infection, but also the more obvious points where you start to see plants really struggling from it. But it's important to know, I mean, once that plant has grown full of that fungus so much so that it's rupturing out of the plant's already full of it. No amount of fungicide is going to recover that plant from what already happened to it. So just make sure you're applying a foliar fungicide on actual foliar fungi like frog eye leaf spot. That's one that it could actually make a difference for. White mold, if you get there before the infection, it can make a big difference. But we don't have a lot going on in soybean right now with these conditions that looks like it's going to be a big problem. The most important thing though is take good notes of where you have things like sudden death syndrome or on, potentially red crown rot, because you're going to go back into that field in 2 years and all of the management you can do for those is going to happen before you plant with seed treatments. So you've got to have good notes if you want to fix this problem next time you rotate to soybeans as
So,
well.
in other words, some of the issues on soybean are really things you're to take care of before you plant.
Yeah, that's how a lot of plant pathogens are. You got to get there. You really got to get there before all of them.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Tamara. So let's talk about where we are with management options for corn.
That varies a lot by crop stage and just like Dylan was just saying with diseases that you're experiencing. And so, this time of year we're watching all those leaf diseases and we've already mentioned southern rust and tar spot. That's probably our two most prevalent leaf diseases this summer. And so it's important to look at the crop stage though, because it's important to the yield at the end of the season that we want to protect the early reproductive stages. And that's from about tassel emergence up through about the milk stage. Some of our fields are already moved beyond that, depending on where you're at.
Yeah.
And when you get into dough and later, the chance of getting a return on the investment on a foliar fungicide application drops way off. And so it would only be effective to treat if you had a sudden blow up of disease, or in more, maybe now in more vulnerable fields, maybe those that might have been replanted for some reason or late planted. Those are the ones that would hit or get hit by more diseases as we move forward, and worse.
Yeah. I would imagine, just given how warm it was there for most of the second half of July, that we probably are maybe a little further along with corn stages than we were at this time last year. And I think we're probably get another accelerated boost starting late this weekend into next week, because we're going to probably be pretty warm for 4 or 5 days after we sneak in some cooler, damp weather for a couple of days this week.
One of the things I think that you can start thinking about now is, I mean, Dylan had talked with soybeans about identifying diseases that are in that field, that kind of thing. Many of those diseases will overwinter in crop residue. Southern rust is not one of those, so southern rust is not a concern there. But things like tar spot, gray leaf spot, all of those things overwinter or stick around through till next year. And keeping that in mind when you're selecting hybrids for next year is very, very beneficial,
Like
really,
if you're
because your hybrid selection is probably one of the easiest ways to manage disease, as well as maybe one of the most cost
like,
effective, is what
in
I
other
would
words,
say.
kind of like those catalogs would have information on vulnerability to tar spot.
Yep.
Is
Yep.
it just overall vulnerability? Or is it more like it's less vulnerable during like the R1, R2 stage of corn?
So it'll probably just give you a range. Usually it's on a scale of like 1 to 9, and it gives you a rating normally within the range of maybe like 5, 6, 7, or something like that, depending on the company. Sometimes their scales are flipped or anything like that. But
They-
so that's important to look at. Make sure you're looking at the scale properly to make sure you're picking a management method that's rated as highly or more moderately resistant than less resistant or tolerant, something like that. Um, and
And I'm
so
assuming these are things that have been tested where they can verify that, yeah, we did see more tolerance to that. And I would imagine, would there be a reason to not buy a seed that was tolerant to it?
um, I don't know.
Maybe
Tamara
it's
may have
cheaper.
some thoughts on that.
There's some evidence that some hybrids, that are more defensive, the ones that certain types of resistance might actually cost the plant some effort. And so there's some evidence that they might yield a little less, but in some of our contemporary hybrids, it doesn't matter. And so, and if your disease pressure is high enough, it would definitely pay to seek out those hybrids that are more resistant, and it might help you reduce input costs, because these are not genetic modifications or traits that would require extra cost. And so there's a lot of ways that we can manage diseases outside of looking at pesticide applications, and this is a good place to start.
Yeah. I would say, I think the term that I've always heard is the yield lag when it comes to some of those genetic traits or breeding traits that just they've been bred into a plant that didn't normally have it, so that line is just a little bit slower or something like that when it comes to its yield
Yeah.
potential, I guess.
But if
Um,
Tamara said, if you're having to put on fewer inputs and manage, your overall revenue may still be better. Are there other sort of mitigation activities that you could do other than, say, buying a certain type of maybe less vulnerable hybrid? Are there other things you do in terms of soil treatments, or how you're managing the soil, or something you do at planting that may have a positive or negative impact on the presence of certain diseases later in the season?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. We call those cultural practices, and the possibilities are really limitless. But I mean, just an obvious one is, delaying planting or moving planting earlier to avoid a certain pest. Um, you can, if it's bad planting conditions, just planting when they're better is going to prevent those early season fungal infections, for
So
example.
here's a question for you, Dylan. And I know this has been more prevalent to our east, but I know in parts of southeast Nebraska, people have been planting soybean fairly early.
Hmm.
Is that mostly just a cultural shift, or are there actual reasons for planting early that may help you avoid something?
Yeah, so this was a record early planting year, and the main drivers, people want to be earlier, and nothing stopped them. We didn't have any big rains. We didn't get held out of the
It
field.
didn't rain at
So
all.
yeah, we got
That's
in fast, right? Um, be, it gives you a longer season. It gives you more time to collect that solar energy and turn it into
Mhm.
beans. Uh, and beans they're pretty tolerant of that shift. We can push them earlier. Um, the downside is, well, we're going to have more yield. That's the huge driver. The
Sure.
downside is, in our case, as pathologists, you're going to have more disease. But more yield can make up for more disease if you do it right. So that's the driver. From our end, we're just doing our best to prepare and get data on that early planting, get data on how that environment's going to work, and anything we might be able to do a little bit differently to help with that, because the drive is to get that extra yield by making your season longer.
Yeah. It does seem like, just from what I've read, that it does seem to give an extra few, maybe 5 bushels an acre on soybean. Is that fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, if you delay planting past a certain point, you're losing yield every day you're
Oh yeah,
not
sure.
planted.
Well, because
So,
you're decreasing your solar radiation time.
yep, but you have early risk too. I mean, you can get frosted out if you go too early. So, it's a challenge to decide when to go.
Yeah, and that
Uh,
frost risk is much different in Odo and Cass County than it is in Dawson County where Talon is.
yep. So
Not to
so
say the panhandle, but I don't really know where the soybean out there, but
people are they're deciding what they're comfortable with, and I think people are pushing the envelope, trying to collect that.
I'm not even sure the weeds are growing in parts of the northern panhandle right now.
Yeah, if you can close that canopy earlier, that's not really a bad thing in most cases.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, one of the other cultural control things that can work, it's not a word that people like to use in farming in Nebraska, but tillage.
Mhm.
And as we've mentioned, Talon was mentioning how so many of these diseases overwinter in the infected crop residue. And depending on how bad disease was, yes, we know the benefits of going no-till or having a reduced tillage situation, but really burying that infected residue, helping it break down, can be very effective in managing some of our diseases too.
Yeah, I think the unfortunate thing about a lot of these things, these treatments, is that it's very nuanced and it's very complicated. Uh, there's pros and cons to each one of these things, and we can't just tell you what's the best thing. We can't just tell you what to do. I think anyone that can just tell you, here's a simple thing that's going to make it better, that's not the whole story. So we've got to know, you've got to be kind of aware of how all these things interact if you're going to decide, because we can't go to every single farm and tell them what's going to be best for your farm.
I think that's a really important point, that we make generalized recommendations because there are some benefits that have been documented, but of course, that's a field to field decision for a lot of people based on disease history and factors that are way more important sometimes, yield related. And so please reach out to us if you have any questions about some of those.
What is the best way to get a hold of some of you guys? So, Kyle, if I'm not a farmer, but if I was and I was scouting, I found, say, what I thought might be sudden death syndrome in the
Mhm.
soybean plant. I assume the information for the clinic is online for
It is. Yep. Yeah. So we have we try to make it easy to find. We have links to the clinic on CropWatch's website, on the Backyard Farmer website. We have links to that. I would honestly say the easiest way is send me an email, plantclinic@unl.edu, and we can. It's a great place to start. Otherwise, the website is go.unl.edu. /plant clinic. But that email address is probably the easiest.
And if people want to ship stuff to you, do you recommend just plain old mail, or do you recommend overnighting things on the UPS, FedEx, or whatever?
Yeah, so it's, it really is going to depend on kind of what that sample is. The sooner that I can get tissue from the field, the better. In an ideal situation, somebody goes out in the morning, collects some leaves or some plants, drives it to Lincoln. That's not always feasible. Typically overnight is good. 2-day shipping normally works just fine. One of the problems, though, is especially if you're out west, it can, even if people are sometimes paying for priority shipping, it may not get there in the 2 days that they pay for. So the other thing, in addition to that, shipping it, kind of having an expedited shipping, if you can mail that sample on a Monday or a Tuesday, Wednesday can kind of be pushing it, but we really don't want that sample to sit in a mail truck in the mail room over the weekend. The longer it sits out, the worse it's going to be.
So in other words, by the time, if you get something 5 days later, it may not necessarily, may be degraded to the point where you can't get the good analysis on it.
Yes, I mean that happens fairly often. 5-6 days, things start to look pretty different, and there's a lot of other stuff on and inside of these plants, and in a lot of other fungi, bacteria, that they're just waiting to grow. And now we have, if we put those plants in a Ziploc bag, it's moist, it's warm, prime conditions for everything else to start growing, and so it can really confound what I'm seeing. And in some cases, that leaf just may completely degrade. If we have a bad issue with bacterial stalk rot in corn, that bag, that stalk will literally turn to mush if it's left at room temperature for a couple of days. So, and it'll smell really bad. It's a fun thing to work with.
I'll try to avoid coming to the clinic when you actually are working with that.
We had one the other day that we could smell it through the box, so that's always fun.
Yeah, it's gonna be great if you already smell it through the box. Talon, just for those that are just listening to this on the podcast, which means they're probably in a truck or somewhere, maybe just talk about what Scout Nebraska is, because it's a relatively new thing that you guys are doing, right?
Yeah, no, we started Scout Nebraska just here kind of earlier this spring is kind of when we first started, but really the goal of the program was to get out information to growers and to crop consultants, agronomists, all of that just a little bit faster, especially with all of this pest monitoring that we do as educators and specialists. I mean, we're lighting up counties, we're searching, scouting almost every day, almost all week, and so we really just wanted to be able to share that with our growers faster. And so we've been using the hashtag Scout Nebraska on Facebook, X. I think I even got a message. Somebody posted one on TikTok the other day, which was kind of cool. We don't have a TikTok yet, but somebody used
get
it.
one.
And so we're really just doing that to kind of share what's going on with crop conditions, with pests, all that kind of stuff. And we range from a lot of diseases to doing insect management. And so really anything that we see out as educators in the field, we're kind of wanting to share and help provide some feedback and potential management on current issues really across the state. And so we've been doing live streaming. We live stream every Friday at 11.
11 Central or Mountain?
That is still Central. Yep, we do that. I guess for the most part, still Central. We haven't had anybody from the Panhandle or farther west take us up on that option, but we'll probably keep that Central time. And so, but yeah, just kind of showing off what's going on in crops, what we're seeing out there, and hopefully everybody's starting to see that info.
Cool. Any final closing thoughts from any of you this afternoon?
I guess if we were to provide more resources, I would be sure and check out cropwatch.unl.edu from Nebraska Extension, but also the multi-state resource, the Crop Protection Network, that has a lot of resources on it for management and identification, and even for sharing what you're seeing out there.
Any final thoughts from you, Dylan?
I'll just second that. There's a lot of stuff available at Crop Protection Network, so take advantage of that.
Okay. Well, without further ado, again, this was a special podcast talking about disease issues with Talon Muse, Dylan Mangel, Tamara Jackson Zims, and Kyle Broderick. This was live streamed on Scout Nebraska, so you can find this on YouTube if you want to see our faces. Also, Dylan did show a couple of maps. If you want to look at the YouTube page, that's a good place to go to it. Otherwise, this was the update for August 3rd, 20.